Came to teach here after Liverpool, although also after teaching at Kingston University, then not Polytechnic, but actually Kingston Evening College, and taught here, then at the Bartlett, then as Dean at Princeton, and now is again teaching here in the graduate school. It would be extremely kind of redundant to give a kind of lengthy introduction to an audience that knows him so well. I'd like on your behalf to welcome him here to give this lecture.
Well, it's true I was brought up Presbyterian, but I'm not an expert on ethics. On the other hand, it's been very interesting to be forced to think about ethics in relation to my own experience as an architect, which stopped at the end of 7 years when I was invited to teach at the AA and found it was easier to talk than to do. Okay, so this is a serious lecture, and you can relax at the end of it. Ethics, I've checked this out, is about moral responsibility, and it's both a part of moral philosophy and a part of practical reason, which means that it reappears in politics. The ethics of building are no better, no worse than the ethics of business or the ethics of biology. In these cases, it's politics that activates new thinking. In business, modes of action like insider trading, mergers and monopolies, dealing in derivatives, and so on, raise moral dilemmas, but they also pose an evident threat to the smooth running of capitalism. So they assure a new practical interest in the principles of business behavior. Global capitalism has instigated a demand for a global code of business ethics. Since the 70s in the United States, the 80s in Britain, university courses in business ethics have proliferated. Within biological research, issues like in vitro fertilization, sex determination before birth, euthanasia, gene manipulation, cloning, and production of headless specimens for transplants are all examples of how technology is introducing ambiguities into our concept of what's natural and what's human, creating new moral dilemmas. So medical ethics is also expanding, both here and in the United States. Medicine is forced to rethink fundamental problems that arise between the body corporal and the body politic. Building is not so exposed. The impact of new technology certainly results in change, but building remains an everyday affair, useful and trivial. However, it uses land, and the use of land is a political issue long before it is an ethic or aesthetic one. I think it was Fred Hirsch who pointed out that owning a TV set does not inhibit my neighbor from also owning one, while owning a villa may block out his reception or his light, or at least prevent anybody else from making use of the land it occupies. So land use is a social concern, and the rights and responsibilities of ownership of land are regulated by society, and this automatically creates legal boundaries that have to be policed and introduces the possibilities of unethical behavior. During the 60s, the question of land use within the city became a hot topic. Marxist writers like Henri Lefebvre, Le droit à la ville, Espace et politique, and so on, made much of the city as a field structured both by consumer ideology and class exploitation, which could only be returned to decency by a socialist government. It projected a new attitude to city space based not only on socialist legislation, but on the liberating effects expected from the creation of a class-free society. As with François Lyotard's report on the postmodern condition, where he anticipates that ready access for all to computer networks will protect democracy, such anticipations have a hopeful side. A similar idealism exists in the work of Guy Debord. Guy Debord, we want you. Now this is the point where we have technical problems, such as lights off, blinds, screen. Oh, that was easy. Forward. Guy Debord. He was a member of the avant-garde who acknowledged a debt to Dada for exposing the desires of consumer society. Dada, he said, asserted the sovereignty of desire and surprise. The error of surrealism was that it accepted the infinite richness of the subconscious imagination, but it was entirely unfocused. Debord was aware of cultural space, but he wanted to compress it into an ideological plane. For him, culture reflected but also prefigured the possibilities of organization in a given society. He transposed the de Stijl idea that art could transform society through a revolution in aesthetics into a plan for street art to spark revolution by subversive action. He thought the ends of social justice could be served by art. If we allow that his intentions were to improve social justice, he was attempting to link ethic to aesthetic, aesthetic to politics, a classic instance then of avant-garde theory. In these illustrations from his book La Société du Spectacle of 1967, he contrasts a street scene of the suppression of March, of the suppression of the insurrection of March the 18th, with that of a ticker tape procession in New York, where the car has been montaged with items of conspicuous consumption. I think this kind of contrast must have been at the origin of all that series of rather marvelous works by Victor Bergen, where he had consumption and workers' revolt captions and pictures constantly contrasted. The ultimate aim, Debord's ultimate aim, was to extend the subversive gesture from the photograph just the beginning, to the live situation in the street, and further, to create in concrete fashion momentary aspects of life and transform them from being moments of consumption into moments of a superior passional quality, his phrase. Art would thus be lived socially, and his concept of unitary urbanism would dissolve the boundary between art and life. Opening life up to art would also privilege building design. Here's a similar case of art intervening in the urban environment. A pile of waste wood that I found in a Weimar street last year. At first, I took it for a genuine pile of rubbish. Then, I saw that it was far too artful to be accidental. Its meaning is not clear. It could be a criticism of capitalist waste, a monument to the exploited classes, or a declaration of deconstructive joy. Transfer it to the art gallery and its intent will be plain. But for all its new content, the form of expression is little different from Friedrich's Arctic Shipwreck of 1824, done at the moment when the Romantics had begun to savor the destructive side, the dark side of nature. This continuity of expressive form is another reason why the aesthetic leads back so easily to the ethical, and conversely, why ethical concerns are constantly reaching for aesthetic expression. I propose, therefore, to consider the ethical in building by making use of the aesthetic. Rainer Banham, in his book on brutalism, lamented what he saw as a regrettable descent from ethic to aesthetic. Banham believed in a literal functionalism and bewailed the architect's persistent interest in form and expression. So he lost some opportunity, maybe, of dealing with the social effect of aesthetic considerations, as a historian is well placed to do. The historian is entitled to ask if changes of style within functionalism were significant, to what extent they affected the functional idea, to what extent they represented changes in cultural consciousness, Today, I want to reconsider the change from white-walled modernist buildings to rough-walled brutalist buildings, and within brutalism, how British housing of the 50s and 60s tried to achieve a brutal truth without actually being impolite. In February 1996, Andrew Benjamin gave a fascinating lecture here at the AA. His title was Building and Philosophy Towards a Theory of Architecture. In Benjamin's view, building and philosophy are linked by their shared problematic, how to remain comprehensive and accommodate the tradition that has so far defined them, and yet remain open towards an unknown future and an as yet unstated propositions. His lecture arose from a close reading of two texts, Maurice Blanchot, À propos de Berlin, written after the wall came down, and Georges Bataille, La Malle aux Dents. Toothache keeps your head at an angle and stops you from being able to say what things truly are. He opposed Blanchot and Bataille for a specific possibility that might arise from loosening the tie between the words archi and tecton. Archi, the origin, tecton, the carpentry. For Benjamin, theory, that which accompanies the view of an object, requires both object and gaze, a play of limits. Each defines the other. What's the scope of this relation? How does one think production and then relate the two? It's not a problem of dialectics, insists Blanchot. Perhaps it arises from philosophy's conception of the architect as someone who cannot define his position prior to his engagement with practice. The need to achieve an advance without reliance on a dialectical process, some genuine contradiction, without conciliation, that is, and to achieve this simultaneously in the logic and in the life world. Thus, the tectonic plays back into the archi, which no longer has the control ascribed to the originator. But this interaction can arise only on condition of expecting a looser relation between the terms appropriate to the complexities both have to face. Building must be conceived as practice, carried along on unknown conditions, rather than as the result of applying already defined rules. This more open position may be seen as the abandonment of an overhanging history. Wigley, in the architectural school at Princeton, has been characterized as a Derridean critic within architecture. As a Derridean, Wigley has gone some way towards showing that if the language of philosophy cannot be cleansed of metaphor, because all language is metaphoric, then it is the metaphor of building which has provided it with its strongest structures. Modern philosophy has come round to the idea that truth is not lying around to be discovered, but has to be constructed. Construction has become a method of thought, and the architectonic has proved to be, in some measure, the poetics of construction. Again, as a Derridean, Wigley starts from the assumption that illusion has occurred, that it has even been perpetrated, and that this illusion, suffered initially by the architects themselves, has been exported by them as a form of false consciousness to society as a whole. In his recent book, White Walls, Designer Dress, he takes pleasure in unmasking the contradictions in early modernism between the concept of proper dress and the concept of necessary structure. The tightly drawn white skin is already implicit in Hofmann, explicit in Rietveld. In the excitement of modernism, it was important to believe in the idea of a hidden truth being uncovered, and this led to a contradiction between the functionalist creed that requires stripping down to essentials and the traditional requirement that the naked has to be brought into culture gently by being recategorized as the nude. So the tight white skin became a form of undress, an aspect of exposure, but also of dress, an aspect of decor. In Duterre's Galerie des Machines of 1889, this gap becomes apparent as a dislocation between culture and technology. The cultural nudes at the entrance contradict the naked structure within. In modern architecture, there was to be a proselytizing spirit in favor of ditching the sculptor as old hat and developing the machine as the way ahead. The machine, simply by following natural law rather than cultural rules, appeared to challenge culture and escape from history. It replaced art, but it assumed the aura of art. One of the odd things that has happened to modern architecture is that it too has passed into history, and the claims it made in its heroic period to have reached a final truth, to have ended the evolution of historical styles, to have joined aesthetic to ethic, have become equally part of its historical story and share in the quaintness of past convictions, like top hats, for example. For the traditional progression of history, modernism had substituted a progression of unlimited technological improvement, as if technology were truly outside of human culture and could become the authentic measure. Abstraction, method of science, was seen as a means of generating new form independent from human foibles, and the act of abstraction was seen as an objective uncovering of a latent potency in nature, not as an exercise in personal caprice. The dichotomy between subjective and objective remained invisible. Modernism in literature in the arts generally did not produce a similar dichotomy, and no eyebrows are raised when attention is drawn to the way that such accepted modernists as Joyce and Eliot, or Picasso and Braque, made abundant use from the beginning of allusion and innuendo, along with the unlimited possibilities provided through the new resource of abstraction. By claiming ontological purity, architecture claimed to be in possession of objective knowledge, and this is a claim that requires a philosophical justification, as Habermas has since attempted. Within architecture, the uses of allusion and innuendo became suspect, and in the 70s scandalous, by which time the ideology of modernism as technological progress had to be reasserted in order to preserve the purity of its originating principles in engineering, so producing the style we now call high-tech. Architects are still troubled by the difference between being in possession of an inalienable truth and being required to adapt to a flux of circumstances on the hoof, as fashion designers do. Le Corbusier had claimed that architecture should be modeled on engineering in order to shed its cultural load. Hannes Meyer had maintained that architecture is function times economy, the extreme Sachlichkeit position, although he later softened this by allowing that all art is organization, in the way that natural forms already demonstrate a principle of organization, thus restoring a version of Renaissance theory which saw art always following nature. Sir Leslie Martin told me that for his generation, trying to bring abstract art to Britain in the 30s, the model of fundamental design was taken from nature in its pattern of growth, its structures of organization, the geometry of its organisms. Darcy Thompson's book on Growth and Form of 1917 was given oracular status in drawing attention to the way that nature, consulting no principle but natural law, produced such aesthetic miracles as the spider's web, the snail shell, the logarithmic growth of leaves on a stem, the crown formed by one drop in falling into the bowl of milk, and so on. Since architecture was now a branch of engineering, there was no longer room for the exercise of a personal judgment. That would return architecture to the realm of art, an arbitrary part of culture, whereas by following necessity, it could claim the authority of science and the power of nature. Now, I should tell you that all that I've been saying so far comes under the heading of 1, architecture and philosophy, a very modern affair. Now I'm starting on section 2, which is entitled, and this is the bold print, you see. I know it's the title because it's in bold, because I have a personal computer. The building task in the post-war period. Okay, after the Second World War, there was a feeling Can you hear me? Perfectly clearly? Am I speaking too fast? Good. That way we can get on. So after the Second World War, there was a feeling that the hiatus of the war had interrupted the theoretical development of modern architecture, which should now resume its course. During the 60s, the short-lived Hochschule für Gestaltung at Ulm attempted to revive the radical approach of the pre-war Bauhaus. The redemptive force of the new was further revitalized in this period by critics like Marshall McLuhan, who saw each invention in communication technology as superseding the previous one, so that only the latest device had value. With Rudowski's show at MoMA, called Architecture Without Architects, hope was renewed that architectural practice could be governed purely by physical causality, and thus be the direct result of natural law, impervious to fashion and currents of self-expression. The modernism of the 20s was now seen as crypto-classicism, a revolution imperfectly realized. It was necessary to get back to nature. Under these impulses, modernism itself took on a new face, the look of raw nature, the architecture vérité of brutalism. The 60s in architecture were powered by the discovery of board-finished concrete. In a way analogous to Wigley's white skin of the 20s, the cast surface of concrete now provided a way of escaping from intention and joining a process of nature, proclaiming truth to material while cunningly mixing two different materials. Like the white skin, the cast surface could, at the same time, combine deep structure and surface texture, the true and the artificial, the raw and the yet decorative. The profession awoke to a new belief in its ideal task, and building design was now suffused with a redemptive ethic. The experience of a citizen army had resulted in an upsurge of idealism, leading to the Labour victor in the general election of 45. It was in these still post-war conditions in the early 60s that Norberg Schulz could theorize architecture as being given its task by society, the building task, he called it, from Intentions in Architecture, which, of course, is entirely analogous to the way that Hannes Meyer saw that architecture should serve society. Socialism had been an important part of the original modernist ideology. Now it was to become the practical reason of building, and building would be ethics applied in the name of social justice. However, British culture was dominated then, as now, by the literary tradition and the arts of conversation. There's been a lot of conversation over there at the Opera House, yes? A lot of conversation. That's not what I said. Yes, it is. Conversation, very important in British culture. 50s architecture in Britain took its cue from the conversational tone of the buildings assembled on the South Bank in a loosely picturesque tradition by Hugh Casson. The Festival of Britain was a celebration of peace and the regenerative power of British manufacturing and design, 100 years after the Great Exhibition of 1851. Architecturally, its job was to familiarize people with the abstract forms of modernism. It was propaganda for a soft Swedish modernism that wouldn't be too extreme. At the Architectural Association in the years immediately after the war, group working became the thing. You remember Hannes Meyer insisted on brigades of working groups. Group working now became the thing, and the whole class cooperated to carry out research, a method of work made official under Robert Furneaux Jordan. Research was necessary in order to analyze the situation rationally and avoid repeating old mistakes. Here is an outstanding, well-researched group thesis of 1952, an ideal urban complex of blocks isolated in parkland, designed by Andrew Derbyshire, Pat Crook, and John Volker. Two of those became anarchists. The architectural style that accompanied this new approach was based on Le Corbusier, but influenced by Mies van der Rohe. The Miesian influence led to a preference for here especially, for the light steel space frame into which contents could be slotted according to the needs of the program. The neutrality of the steel frame lent an aura of necessity and eliminated any suggestion of personal expression. It would be a great mistake to regard such stylistic beliefs as incidental or frivolous. A style shared by many adherents is distinct from personal expression. It has at least the possibility of representing what Mies called the will of an epoch. At the same time, a younger generation was taking over. The Smithsons, Alison and Peter, wanted to remake architecture in the name of ordinary people. They were looking for patterns of association that could suggest a linkage between social behavior and architectural form. They had collaborated with Nigel Henderson in photographic studies of street life in working class districts, and their design for housing in the Golden Lane competition of '52 showed how the access decks for high-rise housing could become street decks, linking quarters together with a pedestrian network free from traffic circulation where children could safely play and sheep could safely graze. Well, that's extending it a bit. This was a fundamental reworking of the city and, in theory, a way of building whole towns. Sketched here in Cluster City, showing housing in continuous parkland, housing in continuous access to itself. It was the Smithsons who provided the intellectual leadership for the younger generation. Their polemic against what they called the wasteland of the four functions brought an end to the bureaucratic rationalism of CM and replaced it with the more personal and self-critical meetings of Team 10. With CM, abstract analysis had squeezed out human beings. Everything had become statistics. The commitment was towards a thoughtful functionalism, which still called for abstract analysis. By uncovering necessity, analysis would reveal new forms of unexpected beauty. They were looking for new principles that would tie human beings naturally and concretely to their environment. For example, science and mathematics suggest that it was the way things are connected together that determined outcomes. So their competition entry for Sheffield University of '53 was based on topology, the mathematics of connectedness, so that the functional linkages would become more important than appearances. The idea was to invent a topological architecture, not only with people flowing across a city, but also with people going from classroom to classroom. People flow should be the source of architectural form. In industrial installations, connecting the flows required for a production has nothing to do with look or proportion. It's brute necessity, and it has no human meaning. Flow analysis dispenses with convention and uncovers reality. Likewise, architectural form was not to be abolished. It was to be reinvigorated by analysis used with imagination, so that we could have an architecture based on the natural order, that was their phrase, as revealed by advances in science. The Smithsons were the main force in British architecture in the years after 1950, when their design for Huntston School was revealed. This secondary school, a competition winner in '50, completed on the ground in '54, was unexpected in a number of ways. It was broadly Miesian in origin, the low-key Mies of the IIT campus, but less monumental, more delicate, using welded steel instead of riveted connections to reduce the bulk of the elements. It also reflected the influence of Rudolf Wittkower, who had brought the achievement of Palladio into new focus. If Palladio could create architecture out of farm buildings and outhouses, surely the modern architect could do it with utilitarian sheds. The light steel structure was used with an extreme economy, which went so far as to leave structural wall surfaces, pipes, and surfaces exposed. What was necessary was sufficient. The desire to strip architecture down to essentials and achieve basic reality was hailed by Reyner Banham as a new wave of architectural thought and given a name, the New Brutalism. with Banham's promoting it as a way of returning to the principles of functionalism and avoiding the sin of monumentalism, brutalism was a movement that entered the historical mainstream. The need to accommodate an unknown future would ensure unfinished and temporary appearance, the process more important than the product. This idea still persists. You can see it in Archigam and again in the high-tech of today. The Smithson's design for the Economist building broke with commercial grandiosity and showed how a building could be divided up into smaller entities that could be more easily absorbed into the city pattern. With its pedestrian podium, it also implemented a theory about the separation of pedestrian and vehicular circulation that they had proposed in their project for Hauptstadt area of Berlin in '58. The model was from Mies. The regular rhythm in the arrangement of the mullions provides a calm visual surface. Instead of steel, precast concrete, and the look of stone. I'm not sure that it isn't actually stone. I think it's stone, which binds the grid into the ground and into the city. The concept is brilliant, the only one among the competition entries to see how to create urban space by subdividing a building, a lesson both in urban building and in urban structuring. But most important, perhaps, was this return to order, the search for an aesthetic that was without rhetoric. The small piazza, which is behind here, up the steps, is a decent space, not a wind-blown desert. It's looking for calm, for control. They evoke the Virgilian dream in Corbusiers' vision of bringing space to the city. Rhetoric was equated with undue emphasis, with the blatant thrusting forward of technology as no longer a means, but an end. The end should be pleasure, the enjoyment of life. Mechanisms should not intrude on this humanistic goal. They liked inventions that had already been absorbed into life, like going up in a lift. The doors close, there is silence, the doors open. The machinery functions as part of the background, a concept that Cedric Price memorialized as well-serviced anonymity. Right? Right. Along with the mechanisms, artistic intentions also retreat into the background, but as background, they take on an aura of necessity. The good result comes about naturally, without resource to artifice, as their book, Without Rhetoric and Architectural Aesthetic, proclaimed. However, from the Wiggleyan, from the Derridian point of view, this concept is no less dependent on the use of rhetoric, as is an aesthetic of exposed pipes and surfaces, if it is an aesthetic. Like the priest in Barthes' Mythology, who never had any sign of having had a hairdo, but whose hair was always carelessly arranged, carefully curless, as if by accident, the absence of insistence becomes itself the sign for honesty. It's like the rhetoric of plain speaking, itself a form of persuasion and no less part of rhetoric. But nobody ever begins a speech, I just realized, by saying, unaccustomed as I am to plain speaking. Just thought of that. It's a good word. So the Economist building is a highly successful example of business architecture taking on a responsible public face. Between the simple structure and the stone grid of appearance lies a great deal of design effort, which the architects evidently felt the need to dissimulate. That effort hadn't happened. The result was achieved in one stroke, by intuition. Finally, the public housing at Robin Hood Gardens was a valiant attempt to humanize the Corbusian unité and adapt it from a situation in the Cité Jardin to one in the heart of the East End. The design seems imbued with protectiveness, the acoustic wall that surrounds the site creates an island detached from the city. The two blocks no longer join together on the theory of Golden Lane to sketch out a new form of urban connectedness, but protect a landscape mound that makes the scheme, in a sense, self-sufficient in its share of nature. The design of public housing cannot now produce a new city, but it can create enclaves, to use Frampton's term, that exclude the worst pressures and allow life to develop more freely in a zone of good design. Good design benefited the users too. It was an attempt to reconcile ethic and aesthetics. This brings me to the third quarter of my talk. We're halfway, you'll be glad to know, which is entitled The Cambridge Circle, The Charm of Discretion. After the Economist Building, the Smithsons were well placed to become a successful practice, and Colin Rowe pronounced that with this building they had already joined the architectural establishment. I remember he seemed disappointed at that. I could never understand why. It seemed to synthesize the influences of Mies and Le Corbusier and indicate a mainstream of architectural development. But this didn't happen, and their public housing at Robin Hood Lane was not well received. And it is true that it did not escape the same problems that beset all social housing produced at this period. Poor people, decanted into large developments, were deprived of much of the social fabric that had supported them. Things like the corner shop and the local pub were somehow excluded from the architect's brief, so that avant-garde aspirations to reform urban life began to appear as utopian dreams. The intentions were entirely ethical. The results on the ground were problematic. The architects were not alone to blame for this. It may be traced back to a more general problem of attempting to think rationally about human affairs, resources and their allocation and so on, illustrating Karl Popper's concept of the unexpected side effects that betray initiatives in social engineering. For instance, both Labour and Conservative governments fell into the trap of assessing housing policy in terms of quantity, the number of dwellings constructed per year, rather than their social effectiveness as an alternative to traditional forms. Many mistakes were made, both in terms of social environment and technical construction. In London, the collapse at Ronan Point signaled the end of the optimism and the end of the belief that reconstruction had been successful. But this was not just a local phenomenon. All Europe felt a certain loss of vision after the student events of '68 and the oil crisis of '73. This is a crisis also within architectural culture in England, where the vision that was lost and had been the vision most clearly expressed by the Smithsons. And the problems of reforming architectural vision was most heavily leant upon by theory in the person of Banham the critic. Reyner Banham remained a friend of the Smithsons, but he did not identify with their later work to the same extent as in the 50s. The architects whom he adopted as most nearly fulfilling the promise he anticipated was Archie Graham. They had one supreme virtue from his point of view: they didn't build, as yet. Their projects were on paper, and in a sense their appeal to the imagination could remain at a theoretical level, unsullied by materiality. Yet their imagery for Banham was full of technical detail, a sort of what he called nuts and bolts sense of reality that entered their fantasy. The Centre Pompidou in Paris is perhaps the nearest thing we have to a built big Archie Graham building, and several younger Archie Graham acolytes were employed in the production of the working drawings. There is something funny here, though. When a building enters society and becomes itself a source of experience, the idea it embodies is to a degree assimilated by its surroundings, and its power to surprise and stimulate is thereby reduced. It gets absorbed by the culture. Banham was disappointed in the reception of brutalism among his friends, the architects. It seemed they were not able to escape the weight of responsibility that goes with making a building that will stand up and resist weather, wear, and ill treatment. Building to last, in his eyes, became an alibi for building with weight. Weight and permanence were the opposite of lightness and transience. The architects were more interested, perhaps, in building for posterity and in achieving some sort of Platonic finality. He accused them of monumentalism. The influence which led to this tendency amongst the architects was that of Le Corbusier, but it was Leslie Martin who took responsibility for promoting it as a form suitable for social housing. This bringing of modern architecture into the mainstream could not happen as part of an avant-garde activity that cannot rest but must always search the horizon. From the empirical side, it was necessary to show that modern architecture was not about a radical future, but about serving current needs. No one was more important in bringing about this change than Leslie Martin. When in 1953 he succeeded Robert Matthews as chief architect to the LCC, he encouraged his young architects to be radical, not in the sense of searching for an unknown outcome, but of adapting already known continental modernism for English consumption. The chief conspirator was Bill Howell, later to take over the Cambridge School. Howell had a set of full-size mock-ups made and succeeded in persuading the housing officers at the LCC that his apparently radical proposals were perfectly reasonable. Taking as model the Le Corbusier as defined in his Unité at Marseille, privileged, of course, abstraction and rationality to a degree, but the outcome was already known in advance. The main difference was that the layout did not call for a deep block with access off a central corridor, as at Marseille, but for a shallow block with access from an open balcony on one side only. In this, the proposals conform to current norms imposed by the LCC for health and safety reasons. There's no great change in layout, but there is a new look. By the time Martin resigned from the LCC, he had succeeded in having the Corb model accepted. After the construction of these miniature unités d'habitation at Roehampton, that style was adopted for much local authority housing in London. It could still be called a version of brutalism since it preferred concrete construction, either with a boarded finish or precast with a rough aggregate showing. It still stood for a tough, rational approach and against the sentimental Festival of Britain style, but it was cooler than the béton brut used by Le Corbusier at Marseille, and it soon became institutionalized. Architects were looking to normalize public architecture on a continental model. Banham, with the Smithsons, wanted an architecture that would be truly radical, what he called une architecture haute. In this detail, you can see left here, you can see the dette to Le Corbusier, although the béton brut has been replaced by precast units, where the aggregate is washed out of the surface while it's horizontal, which still gives you a roughish finish. The result is more polite and refined, and intentionally so. The aim was to adapt Corb to British customs, not to scare people off. Another aspect of the adaptation lay in the LCC's insistence that a proportion of all dwellings should be in 4-story blocks formed by stacking 2 duplexes, one above the other. 4 stories was the traditional limit of terraced housing in London, and with 2 maisonettes, as the upper maisonette was accessible on the 2nd story level, lifts were not needed, a significant economy. Moreover, these blocks could be built in brick, always reassuring. So this is another aspect of the compromise. The high block suggested buildings in a park, but the 4-story block suggested the old street building, the old street pattern. And on the right, you've got the nice mixture. Just to show you how pervasive was the movement to reform the sentimental attachment to Swedish Gemütlich, I give you here my own contribution. Apartments at Royal Street, Lambeth, for St. Thomas's Hospital, which I designed in the office of Holford and Creed in 1957, on a sketch design done in the office a year earlier by a friend of mine whom had got in a couple of weeks of evening work paid for on the cheap. That friend was James Sterling. I was thus myself a member of that group that wanted to bring Corb to England. On resigning from the LCC, Leslie Martin went to Cambridge University and founded a new professional school of architecture. This an achievement in itself, for the older universities were not easily convinced that architecture was a university subject. Oxford University doesn't have a School of Architecture, and I suppose it's not likely ever to have one. Martin's task was to balance the claims of scholarship and practice and normalize an architecture that could be criticized rationally, and even more important, that could be seen to fit in to the university setting. With him, he took a number of young architects who shared his admiration for rational outcomes, but were able to act with discretion. Amongst these were Colin St. John Wilson, Patrick Hodgkinson, and Ivor Smith. The influence of Le Corbusier remains primary, but there's also an influence from Alvar Aalto. In Harvey Court, which Martin did with Sandy Wilson and Patrick Hodgkinson, the structure is in reinforced concrete, but the fascia is in brickwork, so the appearance is less severe. The plan, however, is rationalist and Platonic, a square broken on one side to suit the orientation. I don't know why the plan isn't showing. Let's just see if we can go back. Okay, now forward together, all together. Forward together again. No, must be the slide. Okay, well what you would see here is the plan of Harvey Court, which has a square with staggered blocks around three sides, and then on the fourth side the blocks are reversed, so you have a little break in the geometry. So the facing is in brickwork and less severe. The plan is rationalist and Platonic. It exhibits just that combination of good taste and rational monumentality that Rayner Banham disliked. And although the architects were his friends, he didn't hesitate to let them know. And thanks to the enormous candor of Mary's Sunday mornings, I think they were still going on, we heard all this. Right, so we've caught up again. Inside the courtyard, onto which face the students' rooms, the center is occupied by a truncated pyramid, which protects the roof light for the communal kitchen below, but also repeats the form of one of those Philebin solids, which, according to Banham, have been the stock and trade of idealistic architects from Ledoux to Le Corbusier. The piece that breaks the geometry by facing outward presents its back to the courtyard. You see that on the right. And this is more obviously grander in scale. The students' rooms look out onto balconies which are stepped back, another means of reducing the apparent height and further lessening the Cartesian appearance. The break in the geometry works to soften the rigor of the square perimeter as seen from the garden. Here you can see the stepped gable of the residential pieces and appreciate how this section works also to relate to the garden, both as setting and outlook. Patrick Hodgkinson had built a house for Lord Adrian, the retiring master of Trinity College, which showed a fine sensitivity to Aalto. Nevertheless, the public housing which Martin and Hodgkinson now carried out for Camden Council at the Foundling Estate in London has other qualities too. It's a large scheme. It was intended to extend as a linear development even further to the north, so that it would be more like this section on the left going on and on. It wasn't fully realized. Here again we have a stepped section with private balconies facing east and west. On the court side, there's a large pedestrian plaza lined with shops, screening the car parking on ground level below. At the south end, a broad staircase allows access by the general public to the shops, while giving some degree of separation and some sense of a private commune. The space is very much a deck, while at the same time it has something of the quality of a street, and indeed is directly accessible from one street. On the street facade, the staircase and elevator towers punctuate the otherwise continuous facades, and between two of these units, the apartments are left out. and that allows of a grand entrance on the east side facing the founding estate and the square, where the cinema is now. So there is the same monumental proportion here as we found in Harvey Court, although for the most part the raked apartments screen this enormous structure. From the west, the continuous apartments screen the service towers, but their rhythm still makes a dramatic impact. Quite remarkable is the profiling of these towers. The tops with their carefully detailed vents have more than a hint of St. Elia futurism, and the gable ends reveal a powerful sculptural aspect that comes pretty close to Expressionism, which means that the design anticipated the return of Expressionism that we are witnessing today. The third young Cambridge architect to be heavily influenced by Leslie Martin was Ivor S. Smith. His fame rests on his role as form giver and designer to J.L. Wormsley, the chief architect to the city of Sheffield. Together they built this large residential scheme at the Hyde and Park Hill, quite near to the centre of Sheffield. Its scope can be seen from the aerial view. The idea of linking residential units into a chain of buildings had been explored by students of John Killick at the AA in the middle 50s. And here it was realized some 10 years later, showing you that the AA was always ahead. But it's now a vast systematic enclave of distinctive design. All the parts of it have the same look. It's a megastructure. These blocks, the blocks at one end, that is, conform to the standard 4-story double maisonette blocks, but as they step down a sloping site, the top stays level, so the buildings increase in height relative to the ground and steps all the way down. This design incorporates a certain aspect of the Smithsons project for Golden Lane, because you can reach the ground by walking back from the highest end, and the access balconies do become a kind of street, leading somewhere, leading ultimately to a common ground level. In this kind of design, the attempt to avoid the familiar and stay within topological concepts allows connections like the access bridge at the corner to be pretty brusque. The lower type of 4-story structure now falls into the single concept instead of requiring a separate site. But the result is the complex is big, and it's had its share of social problems like other large public housing schemes of the time. Strangely, Rayner Banham didn't condemn this scheme. There was something ordinary about the detailing, no hint of great architecture or great architects, just the systematic logic of construction. Banham was not immune to questions of style, but they worked for him in reverse. The less stylish a work, the more he thought of it as factual, determined by technology and not by taste. Whereas all the work emanating from the school of Martin he tended to view as too much in good taste and serving the architect's egos rather than people's needs. We've now arrived at the final quarter of this lecture, called Architecture and Landscape. Another influence in the same direction came from the architect Dennis Lasden. He had trained himself by working for Lebetkin, and with Drake he carried out the large Hallfield estate in Paddington. It's extensive enough to demonstrate the Corbusier idea that housing should consist of individual buildings set in parkland, not into city streets. Lebetkin was a modernist, but who always insisted that good architecture was an art. The Lebetkin manner included a deliberate variation of the elevations in a decorative mode, here by framing each block all round as if it were a radio console. You can see that more clearly on the right. And by deliberately breaking the vertical surface structure in order to stress the horizontals. You can see that on the extreme right. Also, by staggering the windows on the gable end. Now, another way of causing the verticals to come out of step is by staggering the whole elevation backward at an angle, so that in perspective the vertical divisions are seen as discontinuous. We see this idea used in a residential development for Christ College, Cambridge, 1969. The setting back creates a form that fits in to a garden situation, as on the garden side of Harvey Court we saw, and even in some degree resembles landscape itself, with the vertical divisions raked at an angle. The vertical divisions aren't just vertical supports, they have a raked look as if they're part of a sort of mountain. So this is part of the same movement to take the hurt out of Cork and make him gentler and more accommodating to English sensibilities. On the street side, however, the gentleness is abandoned for the maximum payoff in terms of city scale. Really, in this case, quite monumental, just what Banham hated. It's interesting to compare it with the street side of Harvey Court, where a similar imposing aspect is revealed. The projecting upper story used in both cases is a rhetorical ploy of the period, deriving ultimately from Le Corbusier's monastery at La Tourette and globalized in Coleman Macmillan's well-known design for Boston City Hall. I've got hundreds of slides of buildings of this period with what I call high overhang. So there was something in Banham's suspicions that his friends the architects couldn't be trusted not to indulge a secret propensity for grandiosity, the wish to be bequeath, oops, that was a bit of a bad one, the wish to bequeath something big to posterity. I didn't have enough Calvados, obviously. Of course, any architect successful enough to be commissioned by a university not only was conscious of the highly visible historical setting and the opportunity to join a select club of great architects from Wren and Hawksmoor on down, but was also well aware that the buildings had better be well constructed, not leak, not fall to pieces in a few years' time. So all those radical yearnings to shock the establishment are replaced by the wish to play safe, to please the establishment, and, if possible, to join it. This is not to belittle the unexpected aspect of much of this architecture, but it is to belittle it at the same time. At roughly the same time, Lasdun was building a much larger megastructure for the University of East Anglia, with a long chain of linked buildings. Here the link was an elevated pedestrian walkway masking service access for trucks underneath and giving direct access to student residences on the right and teach laboratories on the left. It was thought of as a pedestrian spine, a topologically connecting system, not as a street. On the park side, the surface towers are visible as a rhythm, but partly obscured by the students' rooms, again arranged on a stepping section. The distant view shows how this stepping section allows the buildings to integrate into the parkland, so that the landscape appears to flow up into the form of the building. The same hunger for assimilation led Lasdun to make the National Theatre as a kind of mountain, and incidentally the ultimate monument to the boarded concrete finish. So much use of the stepping section. Is this a British invention, part of the peculiarly English sensitivity to landscape form? No. It comes again from Le Corbusier, as suggested by him, though never built, in his project for housing at Cap Martin, his Robé Rock housing. This project dates from 1949 and is similar in its idea to his project for La Sainte-Baume of 1948. Both are very much about integrating repeating cellular units of construction into a grand landscape form, where the landscape, instead of softening the building, renders the ensemble more imposing. And of course, this idea has gone around the world, and Tadeo Ando's mountains are probably the best known recent example of this idea. So now we have, finally, Eve Brown. Alexandria Road, another project based on the setback section, but with an explicit ideology not only about landscape, but also about city form, more particularly the street as a social space. Another megastructure built for Camden Council in North London. Here, as the section shows, there are two east-west blocks that face each other across a relatively narrow space. They're not so much, well, they run east-west, but they have north and south aspects. And this space in the middle of the section is what the architects thought of as a street. It does join at either end ordinary London streets at grade level, no steps as at Brunswick Central. The main reason for heaving up the dwellings on the west side is so as to present an acoustic back to the railway line that skirts the site, overhanging the access road to the car park below and allowing dwellings to look south towards the sun. It forms another enclave from which the bad has been excluded and everything good included. The lower block has standard maisonettes, the higher block has elevator access by pairs, and only one raised deck additional to the lower spine, and this to make sure that the latter provides most of the access movement. In Cumberland New Town, I was standing up there on a windy afternoon, wondering why there was nobody there except me. Suddenly a door opened behind me, and 25 girls came out from the library where they had been studying architecture, I suppose. And for a brief 3 seconds we had animation, but most of the time you don't get animation there because there are too many levels and too few people. So Neve got this one right. Only one level up above the ground to compete with the main street below. Because the site curves to match the railroad, the whole scheme is curved. And this does do something to bring back the idea of landscape. One is reminded of those grand terraces made by wood at Bath. But there's also something inexorable about the total shape. It's a highly integrated piece of design. It's not easy to see the resulting space as a city street, which would normally combine many different buildings and different purposes. Everything is well designed in a Le Corbusier idiom, including the school, the clinic, the social building. After a doubtful period when Camden Council could not afford to maintain it properly, it's now cared for by a housing cooperative formed voluntarily by the residents. So they like living here. Writing about this scheme in the Architectural Review for August 1979, a critic said, I quote, "Alexandria Road is a superb piece of design, but by its very achievement it raises the question of how such designs can merge into the fabric of a city. The street, still here a pedestrian spine, could have been more of a street if the various institutional buildings had been sited along it. As a perspective of houses alone, it lacks that vital quality of intervention, the fundamental premise of Colin Rowe's Collage City." The critic was myself, reviewing the best achievement of the 60s from the vantage point of the 70s, by which time we had begun to realize the conflict between the excessive order even of good design and the coarse variety of the city. Design of complex projects in the spirit of functionalism called forth a reliance on system, using the planned connectedness of topology rather than the opportunistic accident of cities. It created large enclaves that invaded the street pattern as intrusions and were boring to walk through. But the critic is wise after the event. In retrospect again, we can see that the Smithson's public housing at Robin Hood Gardens is another such large intervention, surrounded by an acoustic wall that further isolates it from the city. The utopian aspects of modernism led it to reject the city as untidy and chaotic. It was to represent a fresh start without the chaos, without the squalor. But the squalor invaded the new enclave like a contagion, and the utopian world the architects represented to themselves disregarded the ordinary citizen. Architecture was given the duty of being simultaneously more radical and more comprehensible to the common man. But the common man goes by what is familiar, and the Smithsons wanted to make something strange. In another large scheme built at Western Rise, Islington by Howell Killick Jamis, there was a curious episode when one of the tenants personalized his balcony, making his own kind of intrusion, which we may read, I believe, as a form of protest. I think it's still there, because the official attitude has since been affected by that sense of minority rights that we now call political correctness. We are set to enter the retro world of the 70s, when public housing became sentimental again. Emblematic forms were tacked onto facades, and Disneyland, which began by imitating the city, became the very thing that the city itself began to imitate. So, conclusion. The proposition whereby a well-known style derived from the architecture of Le Corbusier was promoted as a way of radicalizing the public view of architecture failed, in the sense that, as it became normal, it could no longer be radical. But also because, as the practical limitations were revealed, it could no longer be ideal. The Smithsons, too, failed to radicalize the public view of architecture because they refused to compromise with the normal. For Peter, appearances still remain deceptive, and rhetoric is to be avoided. In the attempt to avoid rhetoric, to follow topological necessity, some humanity was lost. We think also of the years of the architecture school at Ulm, the successor to the Bauhaus, which continued throughout its history to struggle with the concept of form. The great sin was formalism, which was the result of paying attention to appearance instead of to essence. With brutalism, architects tried to get close to essence by employing a metaphor of directness, and they were deceived by the metaphor as much as they succeeded in deceiving others. Last year at the AA, Raphael Moneo spoke of the fear of form. Now we're beginning to understand how little aesthetic ideas are about beauty, but rather how they seek to outline an ideological position, and in this aim are subject to betrayal by the actual conditions of use. Both ethic and aesthetic are clouded by aspiration and ignore a part of empirical reality. How this should affect the ethics of building remains obscure to me at the moment, because, after all, our manner of thinking continues to seek a certainty that, philosophically speaking, remains elusive. The search for an aesthetic without rhetoric, an aesthetic that would follow natural law, and which is not the result of arbitrary human intervention, continues today in the fascination with more complex natural patterns, the appeal of chaos theory, the allure of fractals, the charisma of accident as the only escape from the volu. It would seem that the same hunger for certainty that created architecture in the image first of engineering, then of topological system, is now at work recreating architecture in the image of landscape, that is, as accident, natural accident. To be within nature is still an essential goal that we hope will save us from arbitrariness and raise our work to the level of principle. We hunger for a certainty that philosophy denies us. We seem unable to free ourselves from the domination of the past, except by inventing new myths with the power to exorcise. Thank you. Sure. Richard Sennett has one. No? Oh, I'm disappointed. Yes.
I have a point.
Oh, I know this.
Points as well as questions.
Yes, of course. have spoken sincerely.
I think I was one of Bob's earlier students. I can't remember whether I joined the second time he was here, or the second year that he was teaching here. Would have been 1958 or 59, I think. And then you were twice a year master. You kind of jumped ahead of me. I was very much involved in the whole housing issue, as I think you remember, and I would like to pick up on the ethics of it, because particularly, and I think the point of entry is where you talk about Robin Hood's scheme, and that was when you said good design is good for users. At that stage, I think you're probably referring to the aesthetics of good design were good for users, and what has been an issue for me for a lot of my working life, because I went on working in local authority housing I worked in 3 boroughs eventually. First of all, an architect department, then a housing department, where I was Neve Brown's critique from another angle, and then in a third one. But the thing which really bothers me is I don't think there's ever been a creative social theory of design, particularly in housing. And I think at various points in your talk, without taking too long, I think that there are a whole lot of other needs. I mean, for instance, a lot of those photographs were taken of the housing schemes either when they're unoccupied or before they're fully affected by the people living there. And I don't think that it's sufficient to say people like it, and that's the only social comment one has to make. I mean, particularly in Alexandria Road, there's a missing dynamic. The street might work, but there's no theory, and architects have never been exposed to the theory, and I think Korb is a very poor theorist, social theorist, as to how families interact, how households interact, what kind of physical spaces are needed for them. And it's difficult to talk about because it's a missing area. But I wonder if you'd like to address that.
I remember a marvelous talk given by Robert Gutman in the early 60s at the Bartlett, where he related his experience as a sociologist, invited on endless architectural juries, never mind the fact that he was always there on time and the architects only turned up about half an hour later. He was ignored on through the discussions until some point was raised about whether people would actually benefit from a design proposal. Then all the heads swiveled round to Bob Gutman and said, well, and he was supposed to answer. What I'm talking about is not to decry your lack of a social theory, but to decry, and the whole lecture has been about this in a sense, the superficiality of architects' understanding of social scene, which for them is largely mediated by an aesthetic ideology. That's what I'm talking about. So I wouldn't deny that there's been a lot of bad housing, but I would also say that it's a bit strange that what people enjoy and benefit from in housing isn't better known, hasn't been publicized, including to architects. I remember doing a survey of 2 housing estates at Milton Keynes, one by Rolf Erskine and one by Edward Jones. The Rolf Erskine one, all the spaces were small, defensible, and absolutely bung full of play equipment for children. Okay? The Edward Jones one had a uniform roof level which went for several miles across the landscape with houses of different height underneath it, a little bit like Park Hill. And I was comparing the notes on this, what the inhabitants said. They were critical of the Jones scheme because the promise of a social center hadn't materialized. They were still waiting for the social center. But what about the form of the building? Form of the building? I didn't notice that. The inhabitants, or a large chunk of the inhabitants of the Erskine scheme, were critical because it turned out they were the ones who'd bought their houses, and essentially the same design of houses was available to the other half renting, which meant to say that their houses that they bought didn't have the full market value they might have had. And so those kind of researches led me to see the whole establishment of truth in housing as extremely difficult. Architects have not been great on it, I grant you, but neither have social theorists been great on it. And one might ask, why not?
Can I say something? I mean, seeing those slides, once I felt like Stephen Davis saying, you know, history is a nightmare even we're trying to escape from it. You don't have to be a sociologist to realise the total lack of any sort of quality in those environments. Never mind the quantity, and the dialectic between the quantity and the quality and the situation of those housing blocks. Now, why Roehampton was acceptable is because it was on a beautiful site. The Robin Wood Gardens, I mean, what an ironic, tragic, ironic kind of name.
But Roehampton also had its share of problems.
Nothing to do with kind of woodland or forest. It's on either side of two major feeder roads. It's an area where, you know,
I know the site well.
Always
Yes.
gravitates to.
Yes.
You don't need to be a sociologist just to see there's a fantastic lack of quality. And everyone has a right to quality. And that's what socialism should be about, the right to quality. People have a right to good design.
Yes, but my point here is that good design is not conceived by sociologists or Marxists the same way as it is by architects. So I have to say that Alexandria Road, I mean, after all, Neve has been a friend for many years. I find it extremely well designed. When I went through it, I found it an example of good design. But I still, in my original criticism, said good design is not enough. And I just mentioned two things about these modern designs that make them, that their quality, in terms of quality of life, is not so good. No corner shops and no pubs.
It's also to do with density. It's
Well,
to do with the
density,
local
sure.
massiveness of
Density.
providing together. I mean,
But we still
choose to be holding together like that?
still have this problem, David, because what has happened is that the economics of building, until recently when sites have become rarer, have ensured that architects doing housing do large sites. And the result is that one aesthetic quality is spread over the whole of that. So you'll know it's my site, and so that it will be consistent. So you get an extraordinary thing, which I called back in the 60s the clash of the Gestalts. Each architect looks at his site and envisages it, what would be nice, where's the top, where's the bottom, where there's a variety, and so on. And so you get variation at the level of the large housing estate. At Milton Keynes, this reaches extraordinary proportions. The estate becomes the definitive thing from the point of view of architects. Did their roofs blow off? Did they have roofs put on? Just to mention two cases you will know about, and so on. But this is not how ordinary people say it. I couldn't agree more. How do ordinary people say it? Christopher Dean has the answer.
I would very much like to ask you about is that you're couching your ethics mostly on the grand idea, the great schemes. Now, what you have written just so recently in the November issue of the RIBA Journal is a most eloquent critique of a miniature piece of wonderful architecture in Hampstead. Now, I think the ethics of architecture are not only couched on the grand projet, they're also couched on what Corb probably did better than any other 20th century architect, was the individual house. And I would welcome your view about how the individual house as an ideal compares with mass housing for the great populace. Because the greatest, for me, the greatest successes of modern architecture have been in quite small projects rather than the grand projet, which the French regime have been so extolling.
The individual villa is a grand projet in a sort of personal sense. It's a big number for the client, and there's usually a personal relationship. Corbusier's building for the Villa Stein, or for the Savoie people at Poissy, are two examples of masterpieces of villa design which were not successful as houses. And there is a distinction between a house which is a work of great architecture which goes in the history books and which Dr. Momo wants to preserve, and housing, which is a social service and was briefly conceived as such in England in the 50s and 60s. It's a much more difficult problem, and it could be argued that housing is not the proper vehicle for architectural achievement, actually. I would be inclined to think that architects shouldn't design housing. What?
I was just wanting to make a point.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
Please make a point.
Yeah, I mean, here we are in 1997, and yes, here we are in 1997, and there are all sorts of reasons being voiced this evening about the perceived failures of some of the social housing projects that you've illustrated this evening. And I think we should be able to sort of do better than to simply say it's this reason or that reason or whatever. Now, you said that the social housing programs post-1945 were intentioned ethically and then resulted in certain sort of problematics. Now, we could ask as to whether, what were the reasons for the failures, if failures there were, because the failures are obviously greater or lesser extent. I mean, were they to do with a failure of design, or were they to do with a failure of implementation in terms of politics? Were they to do with a failure of naivety in not realizing the complexity of the social and political issues at hand? Or were they something to do with theory, i.e., that they were not, in fact, based upon an ethical theory at all? Because I defy you to tell us which was the ethical theory that the modernist movement was based upon, apart from some sort of reference to tenets of socialism and equality. But that's not really a philosophical, ethical theory.
No.
And I suggest that that's part of the failure.
Yes, but that's a failure of modern architecture as a thing. Modern architecture came into existence as a new movement that was going to get down to reality. And this became the issue which was decided for architects by aesthetic arguments. Down to reality, on the other hand, it didn't become. But I would also point out that that reality was complex beyond belief. The first part of your comment you gave, was it this, was it that, was it the other? The fact is it was those things and more. What would make people happy in terms of social housing is a very, very complex thing, and it certainly has to do with implementation, even more with management, even more with policy, even more with social research, and even more with economics and what people are buying. So, I mean, it's not... Let me defend modern architecture for a moment. You may think that I'm condemning it, and it's certainly true that I'm giving a certain rightness to Rainer Banham, which at the time I wasn't prepared to admit. So I'm admitting the extent to which he was right in my argument with him, because I've been greatly affected by his recent essays, which Mary has published, in which he has shown the ability to think again about many things that he thought he was right about. And so it's a grievous harm to us that he's not here to continue the debate. It's a very, very complex issue. Housing has not been very successful anywhere much except in the bidonville of Algeria and Rio, where people build what they know they can do, and it's exactly reality that they get. And if they've got running water, they count themselves blessed. And if they've got sewers, it's beyond belief wonderful. You have such a low level of expectation that you can get a relationship. With the expectations that television raises for modern society, I don't expect ever to see any housing approved by people who live in it, because we've now got so adept at criticizing everything, and the people who write newspaper articles now are so critical of every damn thing that I can never read more than the first and last paragraphs, which, by the way, is a good way of saving time. There just isn't the knowledge about what housing requirements should be.
The point I was wishing to stress was that to say that the post-war social building programs were almost entirely ethically motivated, what you said. In a certain sense that's true, but in another sense it's not true, because there are and were some perfectly good and serviceable ethical theories around in philosophy which were not referred to.
No, well, they weren't applied. Nobody knew about them.
Well, all you have to do is to read books.
What?
That's all they had to do was to read the works. It's available.
Architects don't have time to read books. They occasionally get to look at pictures, but pictures do not convey abstruse philosophical principles. Look, I would like to refer to that talk that Andrew Benjamin gave, because he was supposing that philosophy and building could come closer together on the condition that their terms were loosened up a little bit, because life is of a greater and greater complexity, and we always think that we really know how to deal with it, but the fact is we know less and less about how to deal with it. And Karl Popper's concept of the unexpected results of social engineering were never so true than they are today. Look at the situation with global warming. You begin to see the political reality which will prevent proper measures being taken to reduce global warming. So we're dealing with a human animal here who is not rational, who doesn't read the right books, but does what he thinks will get a quick result. And I couldn't agree more that nothing was known about the ethics of housing in that time. But philosophers weren't much interested in building at that time. I mean, as a subject. It's only more recently, when philosophy is in real deep trouble itself, that they're beginning to look for a more fluid, more flexible, Tony Blairite kind of relationship. I've forgotten what I was about to say, but I've got terribly dry lips. Can you rush it on a little bit?
Okay.
Be glad to argue with you individually over coffee at any other time, especially on Wednesdays.
On your behalf then, Bob, thank you very much indeed.